Welcome to Flourish-Meant, the podcast on living life as you are meant to, so you can flourish. Welcome, everyone. I have an exciting new guest today. Her name is Jodie Stevens. She's a radio veteran with 29 years in broadcasting, commercial production, and voiceover. Most recently, she hosted Morning Drive for the Christian station The Fish, where she served as host and commercial production manager for the 4-station cluster for the last 17 years before moving to Reno, Nevada. She is also the founder of Genuine Life with Jodie Stevens, a blog and podcast about helping others overcome mental, emotional, and spiritual challenges like addictions, anxiety, codependencies, low self-esteem, and more. I'm so excited to have you on the show today, Jodie. Thanks for coming into Flourish-Meant.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on and allowing me to just share a little bit of my story. Super excited to be with you, Tina.
I'm excited because the topic that you chose for today's podcast, overcoming addictions and codependency, is a powerful message. And I think people are more connected to that than many of them realize as a group. I think the audience doesn't realize how many other people out there are also going to resonate with this. This is a very common issue, isn't it, Jodie?
I think that it is for sure. Obviously, anyone you talk to, right, they'll say, oh, they have someone in their family that has struggled with addiction if it is not them. And then oftentimes you see the family cycle of addiction and codependency. And a lot of times I think we think they're very different things. And what I learned through the years after getting sober, after 16 years of sobriety, was actually realizing, oh my gosh, I'm really codependent. And what that basically means is just I'm really disconnected with myself and with my feelings. I don't really know who I am and stuff like that. And so that disconnection is kind of what caused the codependency. And so I think a lot of times just realizing how the two work together can be kind of eye-opening, as it definitely was for me. Because when I quit drinking, which I did that 16 years ago, I spent another 10 years just struggling with a lot of other issues because I kind of never really uncovered the codependency issues and the shame and all the and the stuffing of feelings and all the things that were really underneath why I was using drugs and alcohol, if that makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense. And I'm really glad that you brought that up because a lot of people don't realize how connected addiction and codependency are. Sometimes they're separate. You can have
Yeah.
codependency without an addiction, but
Hmm.
sometimes they are working together in the same person, and overcoming the addiction and overcoming all of the emotional issues and the relationship issues after you've stopped the addictive behavior is even harder, and that takes even longer. And I wonder if you would share some of your personal struggle and story so people know that this is not just academic. You relate to this on a very real, intimate level.
Totally. I mean, I think my problem started at a very young age. So I like to say first, I grew up in Alaska. So there's your first problem. Alaska's beautiful, but you've all heard the stories of, everybody up there drinks, and it's pretty true. And so you had that going. So you kind of have, and of course, this as a therapist, Tina, you kind of have the genetics. So you've got, in my family, there was I wouldn't say a long line, but there was alcohol addiction. So my grandfather, my mom's mom, was a pretty abusive alcoholic. And so, we had that going on in the family. So you had kind of the genetic thing going on there. And then just the darkness and things like that in Alaska, you kind of had the environmental stuff going on. You had spiritual, really, because I wasn't really raised in a Christian environment. So you kind of had that going on. And then you had sort of, because my mother's father was an abusive alcoholic, she didn't really learn very good coping skills, and she was very codependent herself. And so they call it, like, I don't know, I guess a para-alcoholic or something, where she kind of had some of that alcoholic behavior, even though she didn't drink. And I call that behavior kind of just very codependent. And so in my family of origin, feelings just weren't dealt with real well. It was kind of passive aggressive, or either you would really get in and you would scream and yell, or you just would shut down and no one would talk about anything. And so I grew up really kind of stuffing my feelings a lot. And then when I was 5, I was diagnosed as being dyslexic. And so in school, when I was really young, was very important to me. And then I kind of came to believe that I was stupid. And I had some teachers say, she'll never amount to anything. And of course, that just wrecked my self-esteem. So I've got this self-esteem battle. And then I'm not really expressing my emotions because I don't know how. So I'm kind of stuffing things. So don't really know who I am, don't really know how to kind of assert myself, how to have boundaries, how to say no to people and things like that. Cause I kind of learned to really stuff my instincts too, you know? And so then started drinking and using drugs. And by the time I was 14, and I just immediately became addicted to alcohol because they call it in recovery, they call it liquid courage because I was funny and people liked me and it made me feel good. And so I just continued doing that. And I drank really heavily until I was about 28 years old. And my brother was also an alcoholic. And sadly, he died of alcohol addiction in 2015. Super heartbreaking. My dad found him dead in an Oxford house. And yeah, it was just really rough. But he was in a recovery home at the time. This was, years before he died. And it was called Safe Ministries. And he'd invited me to church because it was in one of his many attempts of getting sober. And so he's in this home and he invites me to church and he's trying to get sober. And I don't want to go to church with a bunch of alcoholic, drug addicted men. Are you kidding? But I said I would go, right? Because I was an ethical alcoholic. So I show up, I'm totally hungover, and we're in this little house, and there I am just singing these praise and worship songs with these drug addicted men. And there's this guy, right? He's sitting there in the back of the room. And if you've ever seen The Passion of the Christ, he looks just like Jim Caviezel, in The Passion of the Christ. He's just gorgeous, right? And he's like going, amen, hallelujah, and all this stuff. And anyway, he ends up leading me to the Lord. And I got radically saved. But I continued drinking for like another 5 years. But God really began to get a hold of my heart. And so I call my brother kind of that broken angel because he opened the door for that spiritual experience. And then I ended up, and I'd been in radio for, since I was 19 and I was 28 at the time that I got saved. Then I ended up getting a job at a Christian music station. And so I was at the Christian music station. I'm playing worship songs and I'm still getting drunk at night, and then I finally just hit my bottom one night when I was house sitting for some friends and I had drank a fifth of whiskey and I called in sick, which I had never done. And I'm shaking and I was just done. I had gone to an AA meetings before. In fact, I had gone to an AA meeting drunk thinking, oh, no one would notice, right? Who would notice that, right? I mean, really. And so these women, they took my keys and they drove me home, but I wasn't ready to stop. Well, then that night when I was house sitting, I was ready and God knew, and I had those phone numbers in my hand. And so I called and said, will you help me? Because I had tried in my own strength to do it and it did not work. And God was saying to me, hey, no, you need to call those people, you need to go to those dumb meetings and you need to work through this. And so once I called and asked for help, I never drank again. But I needed to do that. I needed to call and ask for help.
That is a powerful story, and it shows those who are out there that might be struggling that you can't do it on your own. And I think
Yes.
that's an important first thing that people need to know about overcoming either addiction or codependency or
Mhm.
both. You can't do it on your own, can you?
No, absolutely not. And in fact, I have this funny story because before I got sober, I had gotten the job and I'm doing Christian radio. And of course, now I feel guilty because I'm doing all this Christian stuff and I had shame. So I'm trying to get sober, but I don't want to go into the church, right? It was just kind of a situation that, I mean, a lot of people feel that way. They feel like they want to clean up before they go into the church, right? And so I was kind of trying to do that, but I couldn't do it on my own. And so this is actually really funny because I was a DJ for so many years. I had all kinds of music, and since I wasn't raised Christian, I was really into heavy metal. Okay. And I had hundreds of heavy metal CDs. So I'm in my little apartment and I'm like, okay, God, here's the deal. If you will strike me sober, I will throw away all my heavy metal CDs. Okay. So that's my little bargaining with God, right? So there I am. I'm filling up these trash bags with, Dio and Wasp and, anybody that was ever into that music, they know what it is, all that, right? Devil music, Zeppelin. And I'm filling up all these trash bags. And I go out to the dumpsters and I'm hurling these trash bags. And I mean, I filled up like two huge black trash bags full of those cassettes, remember cassettes
Oh,
and
yeah.
CDs. And then I go back to my apartment, waiting for God to like strike me with his magic wand. And I was drunk the next night, right? And then I'm like, okay, God, what happened? I thought we had a deal, right? I did this for you. Now you need to strike me sober. Like what's up with that? It was really then that God, I mean, looking back at that, I see, how I was trying to bargain, and that's pretty typical of anyone trying to give up any addiction, right? Because it's just sin, right, Tina? It's like we want to have our cake and eat it too. And for me, I did want to get rid of the addiction, but I didn't want to go through calling a sponsor. And I was afraid to ask for help, is really what it was. I was trying to do the me and God routine, is what I call it. And not to say that doesn't happen, not to say that there are people where literally they just wake up and boom, God just, they've never drank again. But I do think when that happens, there can be a lot of emotional immaturity there because you haven't really, worked through all the reasons why you were drinking with another person. And so I like to say the only way out is through. Not that God didn't honor that commitment to throw away those CDs, but that was my idea, not his, and and once I reached out and asked for help, he brought great people in my life and he does show up, right? As he does show up and he does bring those wonderful people to come in and to help us, but we have to reach out and get help because I always think if he would have just, I call it magic wanded me, if he would have just magic wanded me, sure, that would have been great, but I wouldn't have really had much of a story. It would have been like, well, just one day I just stopped drinking and God took the urge away from me, which would have been a great story too, but probably not as good as the silly one I just told.
Well, the great thing about that story is that it shows that God is creating relationship with you. You're
Yeah.
depending on him every day for a while to get through. Whereas one and done, you don't really have that long of a journey to grow with him. And you also got the experience of meeting wonderful people that trained you how to be a support person for other people.
Yeah, no, and that's totally true. And that's why we have our stories so we can connect with other people and so we can, take what we've learned and invest in other people as well, because now I can look back and I can understand some of the reasons why I drank and why, the things that were triggering me and the things that were causing me to do this in the first place. And if I hadn't have gotten help from other people, and if I hadn't have really dug into all that stuff, I wouldn't have understood what in the world I was doing in the first place, why I was using, why was I drinking, what were because it's just a band-aid of all these other feelings and crazy stuff that was really going on. I was really drinking to cover up a lot of other stuff. And so by working through that stuff, and this as a therapist, then you can meet with other people and you can kind of get an idea for how to really help them or how to show them, give them some tools like what, I wouldn't have had any tools. And so now I have some tools to kind of in my toolbox for not only myself, but also to help other people.
Well, Dive into that toolbox and talk about some other things in addition to I need other people to help support me through getting over addictions and codependency. What are some of the things that people need to use as tools in their lives to help them overcome addictions and codependency?
I think a big one is, you know, the whole serenity prayer talks about God grant me the serenity to accept what I can't change. So much of addiction, I like to say, so for me, it was a replacement kind of for what I lacked the courage to do. So I was afraid of so many things. I had anxiety attacks. I had, panic attacks, and I was afraid to stand up for myself. So I had all these things going on, and the drinking was sort of this form of control. It was like, well, I'm afraid to tell my boss what I really think because I'll get fired, which really wasn't true, but I would think those things. And so, in order to take the power back, I would go home and get drunk or drink because somehow it felt like at least I'm doing something about it. Right. And so it's kind of digging into that. And that's where the whole powerless paradox comes into play with addiction, because it's like, okay, I am powerless over my addiction, but I'm not actually powerless over this situation at work, or I'm not actually powerless over this situation with anger or road rage or whatever it is that's going on. And so it's really saying, God, I am powerless over this addiction. Please help me to see what's going on, what's at the root of this. So I like to say, you may be powerless, but you're not helpless. And so, just reaching out to God and sort of surrendering that addiction, and then praying for the courage to not only get help, but for the courage to figure out what's causing you to drink, whether it's these feelings of helplessness, and then praying for the courage to do something about it, if that makes sense. So I think that's huge. And then really getting to the root of the shame. I mean, that was a big one for me because, shame says that I'm bad, not that my behavior is bad, that I'm somehow bad, that, and really, and you and I were talking about this the other day when you were on my podcast, just about how God can't create anything bad. And in fact, everything he did was for us. Like, we're like the apple of his eye. Like, he created us. And so when I was drinking and doing all those stupid things, there was a lot of sin involved, but there was also pain involved. And so just understanding that, the, you know, just because you're an addict or you're a codependent or you're doing, I get stupid things, right? You're gambling and you're doing all this stuff. I don't think God looks at you and says, "Oh, you're just this bad person. You're just a sinner." I think he sees the little girl hiding behind the couch, right? Or the wounded child, And so I just encourage people to have grace on yourself, to, surrender your addiction to God. And then also just really understand that, God sees, he doesn't see, I mean, of course he sees the behavior, but I think he sees the wound. And I don't know, Tina, maybe you can confirm that, but I really think he sees the wounding and wants to help with the wounding that's causing the addiction. And he comes at it with love, and he comes at it with grace, and he's not going to, beat you up if you mess up or you relapse, or, you know what I mean? That you just keep doing the next best thing, and you have grace and mercy on yourself when you do mess up, and just keep, like they always say in recovery, do the next best thing, do the next right thing. What's the next right thing? And that can be really helpful. It can be really helpful to just stop and say, okay, yesterday was bad, but today's going to be better. Right?
Yeah. And that's the difference between conviction and shame is
Yes.
God moves you forward in a positive direction. The enemy paralyzes you and keeps you mired in shame and doing the wrong
Yeah.
things.
Yeah, totally. Totally. Yeah, I mean that is so true, and so it's just reaching out and to God and admitting, "Hey God, you know what? I can't do it on my own." Also, getting into a 12-step group is super helpful as well. a lot of people don't realize that the 12 steps actually originated from the Oxford House, which was a Christian ministry. I think it was in the 40s. So that's why you have like the Life Recovery Bible, and you have, that's why the scriptures and the 12 steps align really well together. And so there really is a lot of biblical basis to the 12 steps. And so I think they are really helpful. Obviously, the Bible is, the final word. But what's great about the 12 steps is that, getting back into this concept of not being able to do it on our own, is they're simple. And if you're dealing with, whether it's your son or daughter, or maybe it's you that's been an addict for years and years and years, a lot of times when you come into recovery, you have like the emotional intelligence of the kind of the age when you started drinking a lot of times. So you haven't really learned to deal with issues in life, emotional issues and things like that. Things that we kind of take for granted, dealing with people, dealing with job interviews, dealing with, and so that's why these programs, like they say, easy does it, one day at a time. They're simple. And so that's why it's so helpful to get into a program. And there's a lot of great Christian 12-step programs, but to get into something like that, because it guides you along and it is fairly simple, and it just gives you a great starting point, as opposed to, Jesus is enough and here's the Bible and figure it out. Because if you're just coming into recovery and you're trying to figure out the whole Bible, it can be really overwhelming. So I do love the idea of the simplicity of 12 steps. A great Christian 12-step program can be super, super helpful. And then, of course, and this, Tina is a therapist, telling your story, they call it like a fourth step inventory, where you're actually going through and you're sorting out what's my part, what's not my part, who am I angry at, what part do I need to own, what part do I need to let go of, what are childhood trauma that happened, what are some triggers for me, how have I been really bad with money, how have I been really bad with relationships. You do like fears inventory, what am I afraid of? And so you kind of get all this stuff out, you write it all out, and then you confess it to a safe person who's kind of reflecting themselves back at you while you're just sharing without judgment. And so that's kind of what they call like a fourth and fifth step, and I think it's in James that tells us to, confess our sins to one another. And so that's some of those tools can be really, really helpful on the road to recovery, and just working with other people and working with safe people throughout the process.
What would you say is the most difficult piece for someone who's overcoming addiction or codependency? And you can take those separately or together, however you want to answer that.
It depends on their spiritual background, I think. So the first one is admitting that you have a problem in the first place. So the denial is a big chunk for a lot of people, because, right? I mean, we want to be self-sufficient. We don't want to admit that we have a problem, right? And this can be challenging for people that are used to being in control, right? My husband always likes to laugh and say he spilled his beer on the fourth step, or whatever it is, because it's just super hard to admit my life's a mess. I have problems. Hey, I need help. So that's kind of a tough one for me. That was a bit of a challenge because I didn't want to reach out to other people. The other one is step 2 and 3 deal with God. Came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. In my mind and in my world, that's Jesus Christ. But a lot of people struggle with this concept. If they come into recovery and they don't have a concept of God, that's going to be their stumbling block. So it kind of depends on the person and where they're coming from and where their core issue is, whether it's not being able to admit fault because I have to be perfect, or whether it's I don't believe in this God thing. Because if you don't believe in the God thing, you're not going to be able to get and stay sober unless you make something else. That's why they say higher power. So you see a lot of people in recovery groups that cling to this higher power of, maybe it's a tree, maybe it's something, because they're You know what I mean? Like they need something, and you could almost make that recovery group your higher power, right? And so the concept of God can be a real stumbling block for people. And so that's why they sort of allowed in this concept of a higher power, which a lot of Christians don't agree with. But what it's basically saying is, hey, get a God and get one now. Because if you, and give up this, because if you keep running your own life, you're gonna die. Right. So you find a God and we'll deal with the rest later. So that's kind of where that comes from. And because a lot of people are, oh, well, the 12 steps and the AA is not biblical. And I totally get that. But it's kind of like the third, if you're in a third world country and there's a starving kid, well, I mean, you're going to need to uh, feed them first before you can share the gospel. So it's kind of like that. So I think those are two stumbling blocks. And then I think also the third one is really in the 12 steps, I would call it the fourth step, but in life, I would call it just recognizing why I'm drinking in the first place, or recognizing what's at the root of it. Because they say in recovery that anybody, even people with grave emotional and mental difficulties, can get sober if they have the capacity to be honest. And sometimes I think that that's why my brother didn't make it, because I think looking at what the root of his addiction was and what those triggers were might have just been too painful for him to face. So a lot of people don't want to face the trigger, because facing a trigger may mean, wow, my dad didn't really love me, or something like that. You know what I mean? And so having to really be honest is very, and this in recovery, is very hard. So I think those are huge triggers for addicts. As far as codependency, for me, it was realizing the addiction to people and realizing the addiction to approval. And we were talking about this the other day, like it was like taking a needle from a junkie, because I realized that one of the roots of my addiction was shame. And out of that shame was born this belief that I was bad, or that I wasn't enough, or that my feelings didn't matter. And so trying to get to the place of being able to be assertive, being able to be someone who had value, being able to be someone who didn't need approval, being someone who was, I don't know what they call it, like autonomous from other people, was so hard for me, and something that I still struggle with every single day. And so I always have to pray, God, help me to separate out, what part of this relationship is mine and what part of it is not, and to have really good boundaries. I think that's, for a lot of codependence, is being a separate individual with your own thoughts, beliefs, and feelings, and allowing that to stand, like allowing it to sit, seeing what people do with your no. Like that's the hardest thing in the world, like to say no, right? And then seeing, oh no, they don't want to engage with me anymore, or I've lost love, or I've lost a relationship. And that can feel almost like you're going to be destroyed. Like that's the only way I know how to describe how it was for me initially, was like, if I stand up for myself, I'm going to somehow cease to exist, or be destroyed, or something like that. And that's where I just had to pray so much for courage. Like, God, help me to have the courage to tell my boss what I think, or tell this person, how their behaviors impacting me. And then once you do it, you realize, oh, the world didn't end. I could do that again, and the world didn't end. Or I could send that email and the world didn't end. And so that's how we develop the strength to get better, because that's what creates sobriety. I strongly believe that, because I think we're using and drinking and doing things because we feel helpless. And so taking those baby steps and realizing I am powerful. I do have power over my own life. I can say what I feel. There's almost like endorphins or something that comes from doing that, and it's such a great feeling. And realizing that you actually have control and power over your own life with the help of God, of course. That can be, I think, one of the keys to overcoming addictions and codependencies.
That is so good. So much rich stuff in there for people who are in need of these tools. I just keep hearing you say over and over again these words of freedom by
Mhm.
getting our power from God instead of trying to find power and control through all of these other things that we as human beings are constantly turning to instead of God and allowing
Mhm.
Him to help us to be free. You have so much more to offer in your podcast and on your blog and in your ministry. Jodie, how can people stay connected with you so that they can continue to learn and grow through all of the wonderful things that you have to offer?
Awesome. Thanks for that opportunity. Yeah, you can check out my website. So it's jodiestevens.org. So it's Jodie, Stevens with a V. So JODIESTEVENS. So jodiestevens.org. And yeah, I've got the Genuine Life with Jodie Stevens podcast on overcoming mental health challenges, addictions, codependencies, and things like that. And then also a blog there, the Genuine Life blog, and then other stuff there too for just voiceover radio and things like that. There's more stuff on there. There's I keep adding to the things on there. But yeah, I'd love it if you check it out. And if you have a story too of overcoming, I'd love the opportunity to connect with you and have you on my podcast as well. So thank you, Tina, for letting me share that.
Thank you, Jodie. It has been such a joy to have you on Flourishment today. I hope that all of you listening have really grown to love her as I do. And I hope that you will check out her podcast and get more from her as she's adding more. You're going to have to just go look and see for yourself.
Yes.
And and I hope that you also will come back for the next episode of Flourishment.